This is Duke University.
This is Office Hours at Duke University. Today, Duke Divinity School professor Richard Lischer takes your questions about the preaching of Martin Luther King Jr. Lischer is the James T. and Alice Mead Cleland Professor of Preaching at the Divinity School. He is the author of The Preacher King, Martin Luther King Jr., and the Word That Moved America. And this semester, he is teaching a course on King at a local prison. Lischer is not only a professor of homiletics, he is also a preacher himself.
The saints are our teachers. They are God's faculty. And here is what they teach. They teach the hardest subjects. The kind of subjects that if you're honest with yourself, you say, I could use a tutor.
To ask Professor Lischer a question, send an email to live@duke.edu, tweet with the tag Duke Live, or post to the Duke University Facebook page. Tell us what you think. Fill out the brief survey on the Duke Office Hours website. You can watch today's discussion again anytime on Duke On Demand.
I'm James Todd with Duke's News Office, and I am here with Richard Lischer. He is a professor of homiletics at Duke's Divinity School, and also with us is the Reverend William Barber II. He is president of the North Carolina NAACP and is also a Duke Divinity School alumnus. Thank you both for being here. So we're here to talk about the preaching of Martin Luther King and, of course, the most famous phrase that he has, the I have a dream phrase. And Professor Lischer, in your book, The Preacher King, you look into the influences that shaped Martin Luther King's speech. Could you tell us the story behind that famous phrase, I have a dream?
I'd be happy to. No one really knows exactly where the precise phrase came from. It's a very old notion, the notion that God gives truth and revelation by means of dreams. We see it in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I think the important thing to remember about the dream was that King was announcing to a still segregated nation that he could see things that other people couldn't quite see. He could make out things on the horizon because God had given him this vision, this dream, that enabled him to see things that we couldn't see. Some feel that he may have picked up the phrase itself from a young SNCC volunteer named Prathia Hall who used it in a prayer.
That's the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
That's right, at a church bombing, and a number of people mentioned to me that they remember King being highly moved by that prayer. However it came to him, he made it his own, and for all we know, he simply thought of the phrase himself. I have a dream is, though, resonant with biblical truth and imagery.
As you know, we're taking questions from our online viewers here, and we've got a question by email that's already come in. This one's from Anisha, and she asks, each year many preachers receive invitations to speak at Martin Luther King breakfasts. I'm sure this is true for the both of you. And gatherings, these are more often than not secular gatherings. She gives the example of Chamber of Commerce, a racial diversity task force. Her question is, what should we be saying or sharing as ministers? She's a minister herself.
Well, I want to pick up where Dr. Lischer left off. You know, Dr. King declared his vision was rooted in the prophetic vision of both the Old Testament and the New Testament. You know, he says in one place, it was not just what he learned about Gandhi, but what he learned first with his grandmother. Mm-hmm. You know, the vision and the dreams, if you will, of the Beatitudes. The vision, if you will, of the prophets, where Amos says, let justice roll down. It's not, but let it roll down. This whole vision of the prophetic vision of one day crooked places being straight and valleys being lifted up and mountains being made low and the lion, you know, and the lamb laying down together. Now, this is not daydreaming. This is prophetic imagination, prophetic spirituality, which is troubling because what people have to remember is before he lifted the I have a dream, the hope, he talked about the nightmare. He talked about the nightmarish realities of racism, of militarism, of of classism, of separatism, because any true dreamer in the prophetic sense has to be deeply, one who deeply understands the nightmares, the inconsistencies. So to answer the emailer's question, interesting emailer's question, I become somewhat concerned when corporate entities or other entities have breakfasts. And I was invited to one once, and they wanted me to tone down the message.
Did you?
No, because they chose the theme, where do we go from here, chaos or community? And they wanted me to deal with that lightly. But when King wrote that book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos, Community, he was dealing with serious matters. He even talked about the economic downturns and recessions that would happen and continue in American society, in the world society, if we did not turn our way from, military spending and misguided wars, and misguided men, shooting guided missiles and all of those kinds of things. So I get concerned. I want us to have them, but the struggle is, and Dr. Lischer, as you said, the saints are our teachers and they teach the hardest subject. Matthew 23 says something that the saints and the scriptures make us face. We love the tombs of the prophets.
And what does that mean?
Well, it means, and when Jesus said that, he was saying that the society tends to love prophets when they're dead, that they don't mind coming by the tomb of the prophet. But prophets alive are deeply problematic for all of us, because King was problematic for the church. He was problematic for his colleagues in ministry. He was problematic for the nation. He was even problematic for his own staff. I mean, his last day with us, he was in Memphis when his whole staff was saying, don't go, stay away. And King said, how can I stay away from sanitation workers who simply want to have a decent way of life, and how can we stay away from Memphis? He said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. He went to Memphis over against his staff, over against the warnings. He was planning for the Poor People's March. He says in that speech, we have to go by Memphis. And some words, in that last speech, we remember he talks about, I've been to the mountaintop, and people talk about that. But there's a phrase nestled in the midst of that last sermon where he says, nothing would be more tragic than for us to turn back now.
Mm-hmm. And Professor Lischer, to Manisha's question, advice for maybe a young clergy person?
I think it's one of the unfortunate byproducts of having a national holiday in honor of Martin Luther King Jr., where people who perhaps haven't been all that invested in racial justice in the United States will once a year link arms and sing We Shall Overcome, mm-hmm. and will repeat the key phrases, especially the dream part, mm-hmm. of his most famous speech, and forgetting that it's not just a nice dream he had, because when a prophet has a dream, the thing that's scary about it is that it always comes true. Mm-hmm. When a prophet says a word, it's like a card laid is a card played. It's down, it's going to happen. And so when he says, it seems to me, I can see little black children, little white children playing together, white people and black people eating together at the table of brotherhood, he's not just daydreaming, it's really going to happen. And a great deal of the audience that was listening to him then as opposed to now understood those prophecies. They understood what was in the book. They were religious people as well, and so they would have, of all people, been the most threatened mm-hmm. by this prophet. And all that has been somewhat domesticated, and Manisha's question is a great question because she's experiencing that domestication as well. Mm-hmm. Tone it down, right. If you can, they may say, and that has been one of the symptoms of civic gatherings in honor of King. We skate over the thing that he claimed was fundamental to his identity.
What's that?
He said, I'm a preacher.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He wrote an article in Ebony magazine, and he said, I am fundamentally a Baptist preacher, the son of a Baptist preacher, the grandson of a preacher, and the great-grandson of a preacher. And his great-grandfather was a slave exhorter. And whenever he was asked, for example, why are you opposed to the war in Vietnam? he would look at the questioner as if the questioner didn't understand him. He said, well, I'm a preacher of the gospel. And so at least in his mind, if not in the minds of the media and the rest of the civil rights establishment in 1967 and 68, he saw a direct connection between what he was doing in the pulpit and the stances he was taking on various issues in the civil arena, including the most controversial, the war. So I think my answer to Manisha would be, never to soft pedal the truth. I mean, you always have to tell the truth about the way things are now and the way things were. You always have to tell the truth. The difference is in a community that doesn't understand these code words and images like covenant and righteousness and reconciliation and justice and so forth that maybe church people do understand, you may have to take a little more time to explain. Why could King get up in front of a group and talk about love and actually explain the meaning of Christian love? So the person who is interpreting that has to take a little extra time, I think.
And you've brought a clip of Dr. King preaching on love, the Greek concepts of love. This is at 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. Could you just give us a quick bit of context before we listen here?
Yeah, this was a massive campaign in Birmingham to change the social structure of the city, to open department stores and lunch counters and to create additional jobs. And it really got a bit nasty as Birmingham dug in its heels, and the King forces staged a miraculous 40 or 50 consecutive mass meeting nights. Every night for 40 or 50 nights, they met in these huge churches in Birmingham. Now, to ratchet up the pressure a little bit, King's assistant, his chief field commander, you might say, Wyatt T. Walker, enlisted a lot of the high school students, the African-American high school students, and trained them in the ways of nonviolence as well as could be done in a short period of time, and allowed them to leave school and demonstrate. This created a tremendous level of anxiety, not only among the black community who saw their sons and daughters out there on the streets and were afraid that they might get killed, but also among the Birmingham business people who were absolutely petrified that something untoward was going to happen. As it turned out, the demonstrators retained an amazing level of self-discipline considering their youth and their lack of training. But anyway, so King comes into this church, as he did every night. It's filled with people to the rafters. Many of their children, their children are in jails, and King gives a speech about love.
Reverend, you have a note on that?
Yeah, and as your listeners, he talks about love in a way that is penetrating and troubling. It's not touchy-feely. It's deeply political, not in the sense of Democrat and Republican, but it calls into question systems that are actually engaging in hate, that sometimes try to make themselves look good, look fair, look right, look as though they were ordained by God. King's definition of love unpacks that and says this is not God's kind of love. And so it's deeply challenging and troubling. So it's amazing to us that someone who could preach about love could find so much vitriolic hate coming back at him. It's because King's unpacking of love challenged our way of thinking and challenged society at a deep level, at a very deep level, and even challenged the church.
So we have this recording of Martin Luther King preaching in 1963, 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. Let's listen to that.
But then the Greek language comes out with another word, my friends, and I don't want you to forget it. It is the word agape. And agape is more than romantic love. Agape is more than friendship. Agape is understanding, creative, redemptive goodwill for all men. It is the love of God operating in the human heart. It is an overflowing love which seeks nothing in return. And when you rise to love on this level, you love those who don't move you. You love those that you don't like. You love those whose ways are distasteful to you. You love every man because God loves them. Now, this is what I'm talking about in race relations. I can't like Mr. Carr, but Jesus says love him, and love is greater than like. Love is understanding, creative, redemptive goodwill for all men. Love is a willingness to go the second mile to restore the broken community. Yes, love is even a willingness to die on a cross.
So that's Martin Luther King preaching in 1963. Professor Lischer, when you hear that, what's characteristically King about that speech?
What comes before that is explication of a couple of other forms of love in the Greek language. First of all, it's remarkable, even in a church, even among Christian people, in a moment of this kind of high tension, that a speaker has the kind of authority and enjoys the kind of trust of his audience that he can launch into a discussion of love. He has talked about eros, and he says that's the kind of love when you are moved by your mate, and that nearly brought the house down.
He gets some laughs.
that really brought the house down, and he had to sort of recompose himself after that. And then he talked about the form of love that simply likes other people in a brotherly sort of way, and he says, I can't like or love Bull Connor in that way, but agape love, the highest kind of love, it's not personal. It's the love of God working through you. And that's what he encourages these people gathered in this church to practice, that kind of agape love. The other thing he does in this speech that we didn't hear, and he does in all the speeches, is to remind people that this isn't some kind of local, transitory type of experience. This has world historic significance. And he often said, you're not just watching history, you are making history.
Reverend Barber, what about you when you hear that?
And this kind of love that he talks about saves you from becoming what you don't like.
Okay, what does that mean?
In the sense that he could say, I don't like Bull Connor. I don't like the system of racism. It's very skillful, and we need it more today than ever before, to be able to speak against that which you do not like, to be able to call it what it is, ugly, racist, wrong, mean. But at the same time, because of that which worketh in you, because of the power of God that worketh in you, to say, I even reserve hope for those who are engaged in these systems of evil. I refuse to lose myself by hating them. I can hate that which they do. I can not like it, that which they do. I can't say I like this sheriff who will put children in jail and turn water hoses. There's no way I can do that. But I can love them, and in that way, it shows that this love is full of power. It is full of strength. It is transformative. It calls us to a higher level. It's redemptive. It is, and he says, it is the kind of love that is willing to suffer for a higher cause, and that is a language, the language of suffering for the causes of justice and righteousness, that sometime in the contemporary church and even church then we've lost. This notion that you have to be willing to suffer, and you cannot stand for justice and use unjust means and mechanisms.
We've got some questions that are starting to roll in here. I want to get to those.
Could say one other thing about his idea of love, which was controversial even on a theological level.
Okay.
And that was his willingness to equate nonviolence with agape love, which was a way of saying real love, real agape love is capable of being out in the streets and
pacifist,
facing the dogs and forcing itself into a coffee shop for a cup of coffee at the counter, that love is not passive, but it's active. And the only way that love can carry on is via a willingness to suffer and take the consequences. And that was a hard sell, I think, in the black community as well. And as time went on in King's brief career, it became a harder sell.
Well, real quickly, you know, in the Christian scriptures, in the Gospel of John, if you remember one day when Jesus started talking about eating body and drinking, in other words, love becoming very concretized, love becoming very in flesh, that you have to do something suffering. It says that day, many of his disciples left him. And King called us to that. Some people forget, I think, Dr. Lischer, it was only about 58 or 57 people in the first march he did in Birmingham. It wasn't like it was a massive turnout. It had to be built. And people had to be called to this task.
All right, the questions are coming. This is Office Hours at Duke University. Today we're talking about the preaching of Martin Luther King. Richard Lischer is a professor of homiletics here at Duke's Divinity School, and the Reverend William Barber is president of the North Carolina NAACP and also a Duke Divinity School alumnus. Here's a question that's come in from the Reverend M. Bryan, who says he or she is in fact a preacher themselves. If Martin Luther King Jr. were to have the opportunity to spend another day walking among us here on earth today, how might his teaching and preaching be different? Would he be pleased or saddened by what he saw and experienced in America and across the globe? So this, whenever we talk about King and Reverend Barber, it's no secret you see an ongoing civil rights struggle, you know, here in North Carolina and Wake County. And
yeah, I think in some ways he is still walking. I think because of in the sense you can kill the dreamer, but you can't kill the dream. But let me say, let's remind ourselves of some things he was dealing with at the end of his life. Certainly the issue of civil rights, but also human rights. He was headed in '68 towards the Poor People's March, which was a plan to go to D.C. and pitch tents and stay there with blacks and whites and Native Americans and Latinos and the poor of the Appalachia and the poor of the city, until this nation developed what he had called in '67 a true Marshall Plan, a stimulus plan, if you will. Before we heard all this language about stimulus, in '67, Dr. King wrote a book, Why We Can't Wait. And he's talked about why we can't wait on the issues of economic justice and fight against economic exploitation. Part of his rationale for being against the war was, yes, the nonviolence, and yes, militarism is wrong, but also because that the war in Vietnam had undermined the war on poverty in America, and that poverty was exacerbated around the globe. And he understood poverty and systems that create poverty as being an antithesis to the gospel, particularly the gospel where the first sermon that Jesus preached was, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he hath anointed me to preach good news to the poor." So I think that Dr. King in '67 talked about the need for whites and working and blacks and progressives and liberals and Latinos and people to come together to build an economic system that would truly lift people from the bottom. He said, and if we did not do that, this nation would constantly find itself, in economic struggle from time to time, because you have 40, 50 million people that were on the bottom. I think if he was here in flesh today, he would still be raising the issue from his perspective of the gospel about misguided militarism. He would still be raising the issue about poverty, both in this country and in the world. He would be troubled about us seeing places where we want to step back to resegregation. He would be deeply concerned about health care. He would more than the reforms we've actually put in place, but he certainly wouldn't want us going backwards, because he saw the issue of disparities in health as among the most inhumane. I think that Dr. King was clearly saying that a society, and he said this in one speech, can't judge itself by the Wall Street, can't judge itself by the height of its skyscrapers. It has to judge itself and will be judged ultimately by the court of heaven by how we've treated the least of these.
And Reverend Barber, you've been quite visible about education, how public education is administered. I mean, you've been arrested and done protests in Wake County. I mean, do you see that is in continuity with the King and the civil rights? Oh,
no, no question. And the whole flow of civil rights, you know, when you talk about educational equality, economic justice and workers' rights, and addressing poverty, and equal protection under the law, all of those framed Dr. King's politics, if you will, that were framed out of the prophetic imagination, prophetic spirituality of the scripture and his other trainings. It would sadden him, you know, that for us in 56 years after Brown versus Board of Education, to even be having a conversation about resegregation, especially in the South. To have that, to even talk about or even create policies that would go backwards, considering all of the pain, all of the blood, all of this. As I told you, I was born August 30th, 1963. My parents helped integrate the school systems in North Carolina in the 1970s. I remember being 5 years old, my mother screaming in the house because I was 5 years old when we got the word that Dr. King had been killed. And I don't remember a lot of things at 5, but I remember her scream, you know. So we don't need to go backwards. And that's one of the things that Dr. King was constantly saying about this dream. We don't need to go back. We need to push forward. We need to push forward. Forward toward more equality, forward toward more justice, forward toward more righteousness. Surely he would be right in the forefront.
Yeah, the one scripture that he used again and again that undergirded his message was the story of the Exodus, the deliverance of the Israelites from bondage in Egypt. And in one of his sermons, he cries out from the pulpit, every time God speaks, he says, go forward. So that was the challenge, not only in each individual campaign to go forward, but it was the challenge for the United States as a whole to keep moving forward. It's very hard to know how to use Dr. King all these years after his death. The challenges he faced were so specific to time and place, and yet he left such broad principles for us to follow, having to do with truth-telling and working for those who are the least among us, and yet never losing sight of the possibility of reconciliation among all people, not giving up on one another. I think he'd be really disappointed to see people flat out giving up, you know, not only Democrats and Republicans, but all manner of people on one another. He truly believed in something called reconciliation. He, through his efforts, established two great laws that, if he had done nothing else, would be monuments to him, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But as a preacher and as a person and a Christian, he was always reaching out past beyond the capacity of the law. He was always looking for that something that he called the beloved community that no law can deliver. And he understood that you can't legislate the kind of vision he had. But so he was always working on a number of fronts.
Okay. Another question's come in about applying King to today, and this is Drew's on Facebook, and he says, what does King's legacy of nonviolent protest based on agape love offer to a church and nation suffering from the recent violence in Tucson, in Arizona, and the continual divisive language that breeds political and social tension with our nation? You were just starting in on that, Professor Lischer.
You know, when a King-led movement strayed into violence or hateful speech, as it did in Memphis a couple days before he died, a King-led movement did not stand up and try to justify it. It did not dwell on its rights to say the most hateful words imaginable, but it was always asking, what are our responsibilities toward one another? We know about our rights. We've heard about the rights, and we believe in rights, but rights come with duties and responsibilities toward one another. We, the people, are one people, and King believed that a nation could have what he called a soul. We weren't just an amalgam of 300, or in his day, 160 million people. So he would have been grieved, of course, by what happened in Tucson. It seems to be a part of the ongoing tapestry of the United States, our inability to solve problems of violence in our country and our political inability to deal with the guns that are everywhere in our society. That kind of, it's I think rather touching and ironic that this assassination attempt should occur so near the King holiday, because we're bound to address the question again and again, and he addressed it in his lifetime before he died, the question of violence and the relationship of words to speech. I mean, this was a social revolution that proclaimed nonviolence as its method.
And you called it a Word of God movement in your book.
For those 13 years in which he was active, and what a brief little window of time it was, I think it's very difficult to imagine progress in civil rights in the United States apart from the preaching, the singing, the praying, the believing, the suffering that was all a part of this black church movement, which was also the civil rights movement, or one could call it a Word of God movement. It's a little bit like the way the Word of God is portrayed in the book of Acts in the Christian Scripture, where the Word is not simply something spoken, but the writer of the book of Acts says it moved, it strode, it triumphed.
That's right.
You know, it wasn't an army that triumphed, it was the Word of God that triumphed. And King understood that. There is, in my view, a very close relationship with the way we talk and how we characterize one another, and ultimately the sorts of deeds we perform. So it was a peculiar social revolution whose language was not violent.
Reverend Barber, about a King-type reaction to the Tucson
Well,
shootings.
I think Dr. Lischer has said something, and I would frame it, look, in the black church preaching tradition, in the beginning was the Word. Words can start wars, or words can bring healing. Words can lift us to a higher place, or words can push us down into the depths of meanness and evil, from which, if we're not careful, we can't return, except by deep repentance and the redemption of God. Someone asked me last year in an article, was I concerned about the words that we were seeing, in the vitriolic words, the meanness, the using of coded language, you know, and let me step away from the Arizona piece, but just the coded language. Like, for instance, one of the reasons we have challenged people in Wake County, if you want to have a debate, let's have a debate, but let's not use the code language like neighborhood schools that first were used by George Wallace and Richard Nixon.
And what's that a code word for neighborhood
It was
schools?
a code word back then for resegregation. That's why George Wallace first used it in a speech where he was calling the civil rights movement a sham. Richard Nixon used it in his Southern Strategy movement right after King's death in '68. Code words like states' rights and code words like neighborhood schools. They were all code words that have deep psychic imprint among American culture. Or like, let's take our country back. You can't just use that language in this country and leave it and not unpack it, because it has a history. You know, that's the language that was underneath every race riot that ever happened.
But now preachers are using code words. I mean, there's gospel words that are loaded with
meaning. Sure. And that's my point. But that's why we do something in preaching, which is called exegesis. You have to open it up. You have to unpack what your meaning is. You can't just leave it out there hanging. And so and language is so important. And again, now moving back, as you said about the Arizona piece, I was asked a year ago, was I concerned about this language? I said, sure, because language often precedes violence. When you begin to demean and seek to not just debate with your opponent, but destroy your opponent. You take words that have been used, racist words, like, for instance, the N-word. It wasn't just calling somebody the N-word. That word demeaned and diminished a whole group of people and then led to a whole system of laws to keep people in their place based on language. The genius of Dr. King is he understood that, and I think that he would, I would believe that his response might be similar to what it was in Birmingham, Dr. Lischer, when those girls were blown up in the 16th Street Baptist Church. And he struggled with, because people were blaming him, blaming the movement. People would say, and part of the license for those racists to do what they did to those girls started with the inauguration speech of George Wallace as governor. When he says, so Dr. King came that day at one of the funerals, and he talked about life sometimes being as hard as steel. He talked about the hurt. But then he called all of us, or all of the people in that moment, to take that pain and do something transformative, to almost like President Obama the other night when he said, open up your moral imagination. What are these girls saying to them? What are their deaths saying to us? What did their deaths say to us about this nation? I hope that the Arizona piece will cause us to be deeply reflective and be reminded of how much we need each other, how we have to not try to destroy each other, how we have to speak truth, not vitriolic hate speech in our political debates, and hopefully, even with the death of the little girl, would call us to a place where what we seek to do in our politics and our public life is to make things better for the future.
This is Office Hours at Duke University. We're talking today about the preaching of Martin Luther King. You're invited to participate in this conversation by email, by Twitter, or by Facebook. We've got a question that's come in by email and sticking with contemporary issues. It comes from John, and he cites a Department of Defense article that just came out recently with a Pentagon official raising the possibility that Dr. King might have been in support of the military war's presence in Iraq and Afghanistan. What about your response to that?
I think he would not have been.
Why?
Because he declared himself publicly to be a pacifist, and shortly before he died said, I'm not going to study war anymore. I'm through with war. Now, King was one of the first major public figures to come out against Vietnam in 1967, almost a year to the day before he was killed. And he paid a heavy price for that. He was, in 1967, for opposing our involvement in Vietnam, was condemned by every major news outlet, including the more liberal papers like the Washington Post and the New York Times. He was condemned by every civil rights organization in the United States, black and white columnists, every organization except his own. He, I think, showed a tremendous amount of prophetic courage in that he knowingly burned his bridges to power. At one time, he was a confidant of Lyndon Baines Johnson. He became a target of Lyndon Baines Johnson to discredit. So it's really hard to imagine a person who says, I was once a pragmatic pacifist. I practiced pragmatic nonviolence, which he did. And pragmatic nonviolence, or pacifism, is we're outnumbered, and it makes pragmatic sense not to attack frontally somebody who outnumbers you and outguns you. We could get killed doing that, and he understood that. But he later said, I have become a philosophical or a theological practitioner of nonviolence, and that is, I'm not going to do it under any circumstances. So he would have understood, I think, some sort of an anti-terrorist police action against those who attempted to destroy so much of our country 10 years ago. But I cannot imagine that he would have sanctioned an all-out war in Iraq and in Afghanistan. I mean, this is a part of the problem with dealing with Dr. King so many decades after his death. Everybody is claiming him for their particular agenda, and it's easy to do because the man is dead and he can't defend himself. He can't speak for himself. So all you can do is to be honest about the record. And the record doesn't support that kind of position.
Doesn't support that. Now, you've told me that you preached on the day that the U.S. engaged in the first Gulf War.
Yeah.
What did
and
you
it
say?
happened to be well, it's been 20 years, so, you know. And it happened to be the King holiday, and I happened to be preaching that Sunday in chapel, and I tried to caution this sort of, if you may remember, there was a tremendous, almost jingoistic enthusiasm for that war 20 years ago. And since we were talking about Dr. King, and since we always have the obligation to be true to the record and tell the truth, I simply tried to say a little bit about what I've just said about how King viewed war and how dangerous it is, and how those who engage in war ultimately are defeated and tarnished by it as well. It makes us a more violent people to be so willing to engage in violence toward others. We can't just turn it off and on. It's not a spigot.
What do you say from the pulpit about war, Reverend Barber? I mean, you know, the U.S. is involved in wars right now.
Well, and have been deeply against, you know, the war in Iraq, the misguided way in which we entered into that war, the distortions, the lies, if you will, that we now know that were on the record, that are on the record. The thousands of lives, you know, Iraqi as well as innocent Iraqis, as well as, you know, Americans who have died, how we have run a war off the books, if you will, spent $2 trillion while we talk about our own national deficit. You know, what if we had taken those trillions of dollars and we could have put every child in a high-quality school. We could have provided health care for everyone. We could have you know, provided all the teachers we needed in this society. It is deeply problematic. And, you know, Dr. King challenged it because he said nonviolence or non-existence. Mm-hmm. And that's why you can't put him in a neat little package. As I'm glad that Dr. Lischer raised it, that everybody was against him. I mean, even the organization I serve in had a vote not to support his position.
It's the NAACP.
The NAACP. But that's what prophets do. I had one professor that said the prophets only arise when the religious cultists and all of the rest of the religious cultists is not doing its job. You know, prophets do not rise up to make any of us comfortable. And Dr. King was looking at it with a far-reaching perspective. You know, one of his last speeches before the SCLC, he says, if everybody else turns to violence, you know, he even young people had begun to say the nonviolent way was weak. You know, we needed black power, if you will, and he began to unpack what that would mean. He certainly believed in empowerment, but he did not go with power to the point that just simply makes you want to lord over people that may have lorded over you. And he said, if everybody else goes the way of violence, I'm not going to do it. And when you think about that, and think about his life and the willingness to take these stands over against even many times his advisors, it gives you even a deeper admiration, reminds you that there was, if you will, this, as he said, this Zeitgeist, the spirit of the time working out in his life, this pull of a higher calling that did not simply bind itself with the pragmatisms of the world. That he was, that nonviolence for him became not just a method, but a way of life, and that in itself causes all of us to be deeply reflective. I mean, there's a story about how Dr. King in Montgomery, when they first bombed his house, considered picking up a gun. Mm-hmm. You know, and he talks about in Stride Toward Freedom his journey to nonviolence. It wasn't just some little cute for the moment. He had a journey to nonviolence. I mean, even if you think about it, that last night, the day that he was with us, standing out on that balcony, going into Memphis when he says in that last speech, our sick brothers have said some awful things. The plane that he was on had to be stopped and turned around. And yet he went and stood in the face of violence with love, with power, and with this deep commitment to nonviolence that he believed grew out of his faith and the call of God. And so I think we need that voice even the more. He said to us, any nation whose policies ultimately become driven by militarism. You know, he named that trilogy, racism, classism, and militarism, as the triune evils, if you will. He said, and I paraphrase, is a nation that is on its way down, if you will, when every decision is determined by what we will do violently, rather than as opposed to what we will do to lift up the whole of humanity.
And this really points up something that I think people overlook, and that is that Martin Luther King developed in those 13 years. He didn't start with one position and just stay with it, except for nonviolence. That was one thing that was an absolute non-negotiable. But his whole strategy of communication with America had for a while been based on an attempt to identify with the oppressor, to identify with the values and the outlook of those who might be people of goodwill, marginally of goodwill. There's this massive use of, patriotic language. He talked about psychology. He quoted a lot of white poets and philosophers and so forth. And you see in about 1966 or so, with the advent of the war and the coming of civil insurrections and all sorts of things, a tremendous change in King's quote, strategy of communication, in that he sort of lets go of strategy.
That's right.
And he becomes quite defiant. Mm-hmm. And where he was capable of saying, we this and we that, we all believe the same thing, identifying the goals of the movement with the moderate whites and so forth, as those liberals sort of peeled off and deserted him, especially over the war, he became quite defiant and said, in effect, this is what God says, you can take it or leave it.
And in bringing home the speech, and speaking of King, he spoke here at Duke
right.
in 1964.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so I want to get your comments on that. We actually
Sure.
have a clip here.
Okay.
So this is Martin Luther King speaking in Page Auditorium here at Duke University in 1964. Let's listen to that clip.
Then the Greek language talks about agape. Agape is more than aesthetic or romantic love. Agape is more than friendship. Agape is understanding, creative, redemptive goodwill for all men. It is an overflowing love which seeks nothing in return. Theologians would say that it is the love of God operating in the human heart. And so when you rise to love on this level, you come to the point of loving the person who does the evil deed while hating the deed that the person does. And you somehow do that complicated thing of separating the person or the individual from the system. And you begin to fight and protest the system and even hate the evil system while loving the person.
That's Martin Luther King speaking here at Duke University in 1964. Professor Lischer, Reverend Barber, going back to the first excerpt from a sermon that we heard, it's the same material, but he's adapted it. You want to talk about that, adapting? What's the context here, and how's he adapting?
I like the version in the church better.
Why?
Because he talks about Jesus.
Okay.
He talks about the cross. He talks about the real origins of his understanding of love.
Now, how do you know which is the real one?
Well, because of his history, of his long history as a preacher, and the fact that I listened to all his sermons that he preached at Ebenezer and at Dexter Avenue Church. So I can feel confident that I know what he believes. And in some respects, I think this is a preacher who is coming to a university that, for all practical purposes, is still segregated.
Why'd you say that?
Well, the future, the title of his speech was The Future of Integration. And that was 1964. In 1963, Duke had admitted five black undergraduates. So you could hardly call that integration. It was more like a very small step toward desegregation. The professional schools had finally admitted 4 or 5 2 years before in '61. So for all practical purposes, this was a visionary person who was coming into this academic situation armed with his own convictions that sprang from theology and from his faith in God, which he practiced and preached in churches around the nation, trying to, I think, make a measured defense of integration in this newly integrated or desegregated environment. You'll notice in the Duke's speech, he makes no attempt to be a preacher. You won't hear many responses called out from the appreciative audience, and it was an appreciative audience. They gave him a thundering ovation. But there are things that a preacher can do to let a congregation know that he would like to hear something. He would like to have some help and encouragement. And there's none of that in this speech. This is a cool, rational statement of his appraisal of the future of integration in the United States. And he cautions against too much optimism, too much pessimism in typical King fashion. He calls for realism.
And yet, as I sit here and listen to one of my fathers in the ministry, to all of us who teaches us, Dr. Lischer, I hear a little bit of preaching in there, and I tell you where I heard it. In the word complicated.
Why? How he said it?
Well, because if you listen, and when he said, you know, the complicated thing, you know, Christian love is complicated. The sense of hope is complicated. Christian understanding of justice is complicated. That's why the scriptures tell you have to be born again. You have to be transformed and changed. It creates all kinds of struggles. You know, Paul talked about the things I would do, the things I don't do. The prophets were complicated people. You read some of the ways in which they got their visions, like, you know, cooking on piles of dung, running all the way through the wilderness, laying in the bellies of whales. So this note, you know, is complicated. And I think when he says that, he's, in a sense, almost even in this academic arena, lifting up the notion of agape love and letting them know that this is not just something you can rationally ascend to. There must be a calling. There must be a pulling. It's complicated when you're in a nation with all this power, and yet you have to stand up and say, but you haven't treated the poor right. There's all kinds of complications that go with that. You got to think about the risk to yourself. You have to think about the risk to your family. You have to think about how power can often treat those who would dare challenge it. And even today, to try to continue to walk in the tradition of Dr. King, it's complicated. Yet we're a nation with all this prosperity, yet 50 million people, you know, in poverty, 50 to 100 million people without health insurance. We step forward, but at the same time we step backwards. Last night I saw this statistic, a step forward in some ways in education, but now we see steps backwards to resegregation. I saw a statement last night, 244% increase, I think, in the number of paramilitary and hate group crimes after the election of President Obama, at the time when a lot of people were saying his election would represent post-racism, but it hasn't. It's complicated. Sometimes it causes you to moan, it causes you to cry, it causes you to wonder. And yet Dr. King says you have to be willing to step into the complication. You have, if you're going to be transformative, You can't stick with what's easily understood. You got to step over here into this agape love that, yes, it's challenging. Yes, it's complicated. Yes, you can't do it in your own strength. But it's a necessity if we're going to call this nation and call this world to a higher plane. Somebody has to be willing in this world to engage the complications of love. Dr. Lischer did something one time that was transformative in my life. I heard him preach. And this phrase has stuck with me ever since he said it. He was on the King Day in Goldsboro. He said, the one thing about Dr. King, and I paraphrase you if I might respectfully, is that he talked about love, but in all the wrong places, which what made him so dang. He would come into a board meeting or the halls of Congress and say, tell me how this budget that you just wrote expresses the kind of love that Christ calls us to in terms of caring for the least of these. This is a moral document. What does this say about your love? What does you say? And power doesn't like to be asked that question.
We're coming up on our hour here for office hours, but there's one more question that's come in here from Stuart that I'd like to close on and get a response from both of you, about how we celebrate today. Stuart asks, why do you think there is still such a reluctance among many employees, I believe it here too, to fully observe the holiday? Do you like the trend among some to transform the day into one of citizen action, volunteer service in honor of Dr. King? So, what we do on Martin Luther King Day.
I think that's a good development, that people should engage in certain sorts of actions and projects that will contribute to the community and to do so in memory of Dr. King. I also think that eventually we're going to see a slight migration away from a focus on Martin Luther King Jr. to a lot of other people who are more or less forgotten in the civil rights history. There are people who were deeply involved in this movement whose names should be household names.
Who are they?
They're American heroes, like a man like C.T. Vivian, for example, who was right out there all the time with King, whose name is not particularly well known, or Ella Baker, who helped with the organization of SNCC in Raleigh. There are other names that we should be celebrating, and I think in time we will.
And all those unnamed people who we saw and see the pictures of the dogs biting them, but we don't know their name. We see the pictures of the water hoses stripping the hair from their body and the skin from their body, but we don't know their names, but who marched to make a difference. I think, yes, we ought to have the volunteerism and the individual helping of individuals. That's certainly important. But we have to remember Dr. King believed in the massive restructuring of society. He believed in the shifting of public policy in a way that it reached down to the least of these. I often think about when people move a house, they don't lift the roof first. They don't lift the side walls. They lift the foundation. Because the foundation, the whole house moves. He asked us some questions that I hope we will continue to raise when it comes to poverty, when it comes to racism, when it comes to militarism, when it comes to human rights. One of his last books was Why We Can't Wait. That we can't wait. We can't keep putting off doing justice for all, which is one of our allegiances, justice for all. We can't wait. But the second one is, he talked about where do we go from here, chaos or community. I ask everybody not to stay with 1963, I Have a Dream, but read where do we go from here, chaos or community. Let it penetrate your soul. See the things that he predicted 20 years after his death that would happen if we as a culture did not get ourselves together. And then finally, in one place he said, we may have come over here on different boats, ships, but we're all on the same boat now. Right now, when we're in the middle of this great recession, greatest one since the 29, we're in the middle of times of violence, we're in the middle of times of dealing with educational equality and many other things. We need to hear Dr. King's words. that we must come together, and I like to say forward ever, backwards never. If there's ever been a time that we need to recognize we're in the same boat, it's now.
Reverend Barber, Professor Lischer, thank you for coming in and taking these questions on office hours. Richard Lischer is the James T. and Alice Mead Cleland Professor of Preaching at Duke's Divinity School. He's the author of The Preacher King. The Reverend William Barber II is president of the North Carolina NAACP. He's the pastor of Greenleaf Christian Church in Goldsboro and is also an alumnus of Duke's Divinity School. A schedule of Duke's Martin Luther King Jr. commemoration is available online at mlk.duke.edu. Coming up tonight as part of that commemoration at 6 p.m. at Duke's Nasher Museum of Art is an advanced screening of the PBS documentary Freedom Riders. A recording of this office hours conversation, along with many other Duke videos, will be available on Duke On Demand. That's ondemand.duke.edu.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.